and then unmute the other. Okay. Well, hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sarah Sladen. I direct the Youth Economic Opportunities Network at Making Sense International. The YEO network is a community of professionals preparing youth to learn, earn, and thrive in a changing world of work. Our goal is to improve our members' ability to design, develop, fund, and implement evidence-based, innovative, and scalable youth economic opportunities programs that improve outcomes for young people globally. And our activities include the annual GYEO Summit, the Youth Economic Opportunities.org Learning Hub, and year-round targeted meetings and virtual learning events like this one. We thank you again for joining us. Especially thank you to those who braved the DC spring snowstorm to come to our offices. It's great to have you here and welcome you, and to our speakers and experts from Helvetas. We are very excited to have participants joining us from around the world for this webinar. We have 197 people registered from 47 countries today. So clearly a topic of a lot of interest. I also want to thank Matt, Herr, our speaker, for presenting as well. For participants, a few logistics. We welcome your questions throughout this virtual learning event. If you have a question, please use the chat box on the lower right-hand corner of your screen to type your questions. We will be collecting them during our discussion and our Q&A, and we'll also be collecting questions from the room for those who are here in person. You can also tweet or post on Facebook about this event, key points or takeaways from the discussion using the hashtag YEO. Today's speaker is Matt Herr. He's the team leader of the Eastern Europe unit of Helvetas and senior advisor for market systems development. In this role, Matt manages and advises a portfolio of employment and income-related projects, and he has more than 12 years of international development experience, including the ILO and the Springfield Center. Matt has played a leading role in developing and delivering training courses on MSD M4P Approach, and he has advised and reviewed programs of various clients worldwide in the field of youth employment and poverty reduction. Our moderator for today's event is our Vice President at Making Sense International, Dr. Christy Olenik. In her 25-year career, Christy has designed, implemented, and evaluated holistic youth programs for multiple donors, local governments, and private foundations in the U.S. and internationally. As VP for Technical Services at Making Sense, Christy is responsible for technical leadership, service delivery, business development, and strategy around positive youth development programming. Christy also serves as Making Sense Project Director for the USAID-funded Youth Power Evidence and Evaluation IDIQ. Christy is passionate about providing opportunities for youth success and for building the capacity of the systems around them. And so with that, I will turn it over to Christy to introduce the topic of today's webinar and to open up today's presentation. Christy, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. I'm excited to serve as moderator of this webinar focused on enhancing youth employment using a market systems approach. I apologize that I couldn't be there in person because of this crazy snowstorm, but I'm very happy to be joining virtually. Making Sense has been working on reducing barriers to youth employment for almost 20 years. We approach this work in a number of different ways by providing capacity building, research, and strategic consulting in areas like entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, and workforce development. One recent activity of ours, which I believe relates well to today's topic, is a research study we completed last year funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, where we mapped out a demand-driven training for youth employment framework based on the best practices of 10 demand-driven training organizations who are listed here. The way we define demand-driven training is presented on this slide and is based on the notion that those skills training initiatives most aligned with employer needs are also the most successful for youth. The framework that we developed, as you can see here, captures the critical processes these demand-driven training programs have created to build strong relationships with employers and other important partners. This is noted on the left, and the screening, training, job placement, and post-placement processes they've established to get youth ready for employment. These processes are noted on the right. Based on this framework, we developed the Demand-Driven Training for Youth Employment Toolkit. You can see the web address here where you can find the toolkit, and I believe that Benjamin's going to include it in the chat box as well. But the toolkit's designed to help bridge the gap between youth skills and employer needs by bringing detailed descriptions and examples of these best practices, along with tools and resources that can be used by youth employment training providers to better align with the labor market. The toolkit is set up using the framework we just looked at and includes modules on understanding the labor market, partnering with employers, screening and assessment, developing soft skills, mentoring, and implementing work-based learning activities. We hope the toolkit will also be used as a platform to create discussion between training providers and employers to ensure that the systems are set up in such a way that youth have a strong bridge to cross as they move from education to employment. And I believe that what we'll be hearing from Helvetas today will help us expand our thinking on how to reflect on these systems. And I know that the presentation will have a particular eye on equity and inclusion. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Matt from Helvetas for his presentation. And then, as Sarah said, we'll have some time at the end for questions. So, Matt?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah and Christy. I really appreciate the introduction as well. I'm very excited to be here with you, also to have so many people participating over the webinar. I would actually like to start with this picture. I like that a lot because it basically shows three generations of women in Kosovo, actually. We see Arta, a 26-year-old woman, on the right side, together with her mother and grandmother. Arta is a social media specialist, and she's advising businesses in Kosovo on her internet appearance, basically. That's something her grandmother probably would never have been able to imagine doing. She basically worked at home taking care of the family. So the combination of education, vocational education, and economic opportunities in Kosovo has had a positive impact over the different generations. So that's really, so it's a picture that illustrates also the hopes and the prospects of young people, not only in Kosovo, but probably also in the other countries that we work in. Nevertheless, as we all probably know, the global challenge on youth employment is enormous. If we only look at a recent study done by the ILO, global unemployment rates are rising, actually, at 13% currently. 71 million young people without jobs worldwide. In Kosovo, where Arta is from, unemployment rate is at 53%, and that's quite similar to other countries in the Balkans, where we also have official unemployment rates of between 50 and 60%. That's enormous. It just illustrates the challenge that we also face. And it's not only that unemployment or inactivity rates are very high. It's also that young people are often affected by poverty despite having jobs. We find young people also often affected by poor working conditions. Informality is certainly a big issue with young people in Kosovo as well. Also being passed on from one short-term employment to the other, or one internship to the other, without the prospects of having longer-term employment contracts. That's certainly a topic that particularly affects many young people. In the Balkans, where I work, young people also rely a lot on remittances sent back from family members, mostly in Western Europe. It's not only high unemployment, poor working conditions, it's also the inequality to access to opportunities that is another issue. As a young woman, your opportunity to access jobs and income is very different to young men. it relates to the lack of childcare services, for example, that prevent young women to do a career. It relates to the lack of legal protection, social security, that often lets women lose their jobs when they are pregnant or they go on maternity leave. So women face additional barriers in entering on the labor market. And the same with minorities. Sometimes language issues are a problem, discrimination. So there are lots of different types of problems that young people face on the labor market. Basically, what I want to do with this presentation is just outline three very simple messages that are based a bit on our experience in Eastern Europe. And while I will present an example from Kosovo, I think these lessons are probably useful, or hopefully useful, for people working on youth employment in other parts of the world. As you can see, I also brought you some Swiss mountains, chocolates. I'll show a Swiss watch also later on, just to make the connection to Switzerland. But basically, what I want to emphasize here are three messages. The one is about applying a holistic approach to youth employment. The other is about being systemic in the approach that we choose to implement in order to achieve greater sustainability and scale. And the third point is about inclusion, how we go about that. So if we could just go to the next slide. As I said earlier, youth employment is a huge challenge. The numbers are overwhelming. So in order to find an appropriate, we need to find an appropriate response actually to address this global challenge in a significant manner. And a starting point for doing so is to recognize the different dimensions, the different factors that contribute to youth employment or determine youth unemployment actually. And this is where a market systems development approach is quite helpful to think a little bit about what are the different dimensions that constitute or that contribute to youth employment. A typical entry point to youth employment is the education side. We have many projects working on vocational education and training. So that's been the traditional entry point to youth employment. And in earlier days, that meant a project going into a country and basically providing training to young people. I think in the meanwhile, we got a bit smarter and we're actually looking at how education systems function. We're looking at how to reform education system, how to build public-private partnerships around education, whether it's higher or vocational education. But what we realize is that a good education does not necessarily bring young people into jobs. So apart from looking on the supply side of the labor market, we also need to look at the demand side. So we have more and more projects also in the region where I work that actually try to stimulate private sector growth and investment in order to create jobs for young people. One key point here is that we do so in sectors that are relevant and provide interesting job opportunities to young people. Now, having jobs on the one side and well-trained, educated young people on the other side does not necessarily mean that they find each other. We have a very paradoxical situation in the Balkans where companies actually complain about the fact that they cannot find the sufficient workforce or skilled workforce while we have a huge unemployment rate. And this basically relates to the absence of various types of services that would actually link the two sides. We talk about job matching, information services. Examples are public employment services that are underperforming in probably most of the countries we work in. We talk about private recruitment firms. We talk about online job portals. Even the role of media. Young students often have a wrong perception of what to expect from jobs, which jobs to choose. They don't have the right information about trends, requirements on the labor market. So the media plays an important role in linking supply and demand. In Kosovo, we're also working now more and more on career guidance embedded in vocational education schools. So we're looking at that whole area of intermediation between supply and demand. And then obviously around that we have a large set of policies and regulations that determine also the performance of each of these areas, whether it's on education policies, whether it's policies intended to stimulate growth in certain sectors. So also that has a huge impact on the ability of young people actually to find jobs. So a market systems approach helps us to sort of figure a little bit out also what matters. I just put this slide over here just to show where the Swiss Development Corporation currently is working on youth employment in the Balkans. So what you can see here is that this holistic approach, as I call it, also is reflected in the design of the different country portfolios. If you look at Bosnia, for example, we have a project that would focus on education, vocational education. We have a project that is working with the Public Employment Service as intermediation, and we have a Helvetas implemented project, the Market Makers project that's working on the demand side, trying to stimulate growth and investment in certain sectors like IT, tourism, food industry, and others. So you see how this holistic approach translates into the design of a country portfolio of a donor. And as Helvetas, we implement parts of that portfolio. Sometimes also they come up with projects that are quite comprehensive. If you just go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a bit about the I project. I stands for Enhancing Youth Employment. That's the project that we implement in Kosovo jointly with Management Development Associates. It's a project of about 7.5 million or Swiss francs size. That's about $7.5 million, more or less. Has a team size of about 15 people. It's led by Tim Sparkman and Durim Hoxha. And it's funded by SDC, the Swiss Development Corporation. It's part of their country portfolio to address youth employment. So there's another project apart from I that's working more on the private sector development side that stimulates growth, job creation. It's called the Promoting Private Sector Employment project implemented by Swiss Contact. Nevertheless, I consists of three components. On the very right, you won't be able to read that, but just to demonstrate to you, on the very right we have a component that actually overlaps a little bit with the other project, where we try and stimulate opportunities within the private sector, stimulate enterprise growth, job creation. Yeah. On the very left, we have a component that now looks into vocational education and training. So there we're working particularly on sort of linking private sector to vet schools in the different municipalities. And in the middle, we do now a lot of work on career guidance in the municipalities. Also there, we're working with vet schools, municipalities, and then also the Ministry for labor, basically at a national level. So you can see a bit how this holistic approach translates into the design of programs actually and portfolios. The market systems approach is basically sort of the guiding approach through all of this. So we look at very typical markets such as manufacturing, IT, tourism, retail, agro-processing. So we work both in education, but also stimulating growth and investment in these sectors. But there are also very non-typical markets, such as career guidance, vet schooling, media, job portals, which we also look through a market systems development lens. So if we come to the next slide, that's where I bring in the Swiss watch, because I like this picture. It illustrates complexity, actually, and that's quite symbolic also for the type of systems that we're working in. Systems are complex, they're dynamic, they're unpredictable. So all the more challenging it is for us to actually change these systems in order to produce better outcomes for youth. So the starting point for us always is to realize that our target groups, in this case youth, are never exist in isolation. They're always part of a system. That system is currently not functioning for them. So in order to have really large scale and sustainable impact for youth, we need to change the way how these systems function. That's the underlying idea of a market systems development approach. So just to give you a bit of an example of how that translates into practice. Years ago, when we worked on vocational education, we would hire an international expert to develop great curricula for vocational education. Yeah? And then after a few years, we would realize the curricula is outdated and nobody was updating the curricula anymore. And if not another project came along to update the curricula, it would more or less stay that way. Yeah? I've worked on a case in Bangladesh where I looked at curricula that were basically outdated and originating from 1956. So today we've become a bit smarter. So we realize that curricula development is actually a critical function within the education system. Yeah? So we need to understand what actually prevents curricula development. We're trying to embed that within the system. We're building public-private partnerships around curricula development so that new curricula are developed based on economic trends and developments, and they're regularly updated. So there's an adaptive element also within education systems that we need to look at. Yeah? So that's what I mean with sort of like building in systemic change, systemic change ambition into our youth employment project designs. The MSD approach, if we could just have a look at the next slide. The MSD approach basically provides us a guidance, principles and frameworks to think through questions of scale and sustainability along a very typical project cycle. So if you want to read more about the MSD approach, I can recommend the operational guide. It's a very interesting read, actually. So you can download that from Beam Exchange, beamexchange.org, if you're interested to know more about that. But what is important here, perhaps to keep in mind, is that market systems development is not necessarily about markets or private sector per se. The idea of markets is more around relationships, exchanges, transactions, and that's the core of what we're interested in as development organizations when we work, for example, in youth employment. We're interested in the exchange between youth and schools or youth and enterprises. So don't get too much hung up on the term markets or private sector. It is rather an approach that helps us to understand the complexity of systems, to operationalize also this complexity and translate that into strategies that take into account scale and sustainability, but also inclusion. If we look at the I project, if I can give a specific example from the I project, particularly from that part that is about intermediation services. When I started that's now 6 years ago. The whole job matching was not functioning properly. We had public employment services, but they were very much underperforming. We had newspapers basically that were advertising vacancies, but these newspapers had a poor coverage, particularly in rural areas, particularly with young people who don't tend to read newspapers. Yeah, so there were 3 online portals actually that were advertising vacancies, but they were very small at the time, and it was more done as a side thing, but it was not run as a serious business. So what the I project basically did, it started working with these existing online portals and work with them on their business model. So that meant exposure trips, for example, to Bosnia, where there is a very successful online portal, learning from each other, exchanging. It meant sort of helping them, supporting them to think through their income streams around advertisement of jobs, job vacancies. So a lot of work was done sort of in capacity building and sensitization on how to turn online job portal into a profitable business opportunity. So that was the idea and the work behind the I project's intervention there. What you can see is that had quite a success. Actually, you can see the numbers of vacancies advertised through private service providers per year increasing rapidly from 1,000 to 20,000, more than 20,000 vacancies advertised over these. Actually, there were 2 online portals in the end. One actually didn't join into that. You can see also the number of job seekers that are using these services increasing exponentially. So young people suddenly have this platform available where they can see the vacancies. Yeah? So these are very impressive numbers that we get by looking at a specific function within that system and trying to look at it also through the lens of how you turn that into a sustainable business opportunity. You can also see that these 2 companies that are running these job portals are running it in the meanwhile as a very profitable business. So they will certainly continue also beyond the project. So right now we're actually just monitoring these 2 companies. If you could just go to the next slide. We don't just want to change system for the sake of changing systems. We want to change systems in order to become more inclusive for certain groups that are currently disadvantaged by the way these systems work. Youth in general face a lot of obstacles in accessing opportunities in the labor market. Yeah. But what we need to do is to more strongly differentiate between certain subgroups. As I mentioned earlier, women face additional barriers in accessing job and career opportunities. Minorities face additional barriers in accessing job and career opportunities in certain countries. So what that requires is, first of all, an understanding of what these specific obstacles are. So we need to do very targeted analysis also to understand the barriers that specific subgroups face within the larger category of youth, and we need to develop very specific targeted measures on how to reduce entry barriers for these groups. If we go to Kosovo, just briefly, I mentioned the example of online job portals. This is one of them, Kosovo Job. It's an Albanian-speaking online job portal, basically. If we could just show the next slide, please. Now, if you see the population composition of Kosovo, Albanian is surely the majority of what people speak, but we have a very large Serbian-speaking minority. We also have a lot of Roma communities in Kosovo. So you can see that particularly in the north of Kosovo, we have a predominantly Serbian population. It's also a part that is not that's also probably a reason why Kosovo is also not recognized by many countries, especially by Serbia. So the question basically for us was, okay, we're providing a new service to youth in Kosovo, but it's in Albanian, which means that the Serbian population has no access to that service. So what we're working on right now is to see how can we change that. Is it just a matter of putting a Serbian translation function onto the website, so they can also read these job ads in Serbian? What are the costs around that? Is it profitable for the company to do that because it's a smaller market? So we're looking at business models actually on how to extend this service also to a Serbian minority in Kosovo. Also, we have very targeted interventions that stimulate entrepreneurship in these communities in the north, and then also with Roma communities. We're looking at particularly social entrepreneurship as a way to also stimulate job creation within those regions with a predominantly with minority communities over there. There are many challenges that we face in our work. The list is very long. It ranges from very practical questions on for example, on how do we bring the private sector into vocational education and training? How do we incentivize private sector to participate in education training? Very practical questions that donors often face on how to design a youth employment project portfolio or a program. So a lot of practical questions related to that, but also questions around gender and social inclusion, how to find the right strategy to reduce these entry barriers for minorities and women. And there are also much more complex questions, for example, related to the future of work. We live in a world where the notion of work is changing very rapidly because of technological advancements we make, various other reasons. So the question for us is also always whether we are sufficiently preparing young people actually for the future of work, or whether we're just sort of trying to cope with the status quo. There are lots of challenges, and I'm sure that each one of us here in the room and also listening on the webinar would be able to contribute to these type of challenges. So these are a bit sort of around three key takeaways from my side: the holistic approach, a systemic approach, and also being inclusive. And maybe a question from my side is also as to in how far you made experiences with this, and what are the type of challenges also you face in doing so.
Thank you so much, Matt, for your presentation. Certainly the questions around the future of work and how we apply these concepts to the way the economy is changing, the way the world is changing, is something that we're exploring as part of the network's theme this year and at the summit this fall. So it's great that you've put this into context, and I think the question of systems will be part of a cross-cutting theme that we include this year. Before we turn to questions online, I know we received some really interesting questions into the chat box. Wanted to give a chance to those in the room to raise questions, if there are any. And if you have a question, if you could say your name and your organization, since folks online can't see who you are, that would be great. And we can take a couple in the room, and then I'll turn it back over to Christy to moderate some of the online questions with you, Matt. Okay. I'm just going to move the microphone over in case there are questions. They put you all on the spot. If we don't, that's fine. You can take them from online. Okay. Christy, do you want to pick up some of the questions that were raised during the presentation?
Absolutely. We've got a lot going on online here. So the first question, Matt, is curious about financing. In your case, how did you pay for the training services and whether or not this was embedded in the market system approach? I'm assuming that's for the I project.
Mm-hmm. We always try to reduce the financing to a minimum. So we work with existing schools and training providers, both on what we call the formal side, like formal vet schools, public vet schools, or even in the previous phase we worked with universities, but also non-formal training providers such as private commercial training providers, basically, and there are different ways on how, approaching it finance-wise. With public schools, obviously, finance is not necessarily the key constraint. It's more about finding new ways of collaboration between schools and private sector. And what we, for example, found in the countries that we work in is that private sector already themselves invests a significant degree in training. That is actually part of their problem. Actually, they would like to invest less in training, but they do already put a lot of money into it. So finance is not necessarily the most important aspect when we work with public training providers. When it comes to sort of private training providers, it's a bit different. There, with the I project, but also with other projects in the region, it's about stimulating new types of training services. So usually there's a degree of seed capital involved in order to kick off something. We usually try and find cost-sharing solutions, as I said, where we try and invest as little as possible and get our partners, the training providers, invest as much as possible in order to also increase their ownership over what we're trying to achieve. So that's where we're always very cautious about in terms of financing.
Great. Thank you for that. There's another question around values and employment. And I think what Laura's trying to get at is that younger people, the younger generation now, is very sensitive to the value of organizations and companies. They want to be working for organizations and companies that are doing good things. And so what have you seen in that regard with how well companies are engaging youth through their values, what they're producing, what they're doing? You mentioned, I recall, some work around social entrepreneurship, for example. So I'm curious what you think about that question.
Yeah, yes, we try to do more on social entrepreneurship. So companies that engage or make a profit, actually, that they reinvest into social causes. That's a fairly new concept, actually, in the countries that we're working on. There are also legislative problems around that don't always allow these type of companies to make a profit, which undermines a bit their sustainability. I can't say too much about whether young people aim to go specifically into these type of jobs where they find their values more reflected. That's something we would need to look into more. What I can say is that we find that a lot of young people in the Balkan region have a bit of a wrong perception, actually, in terms of what they can expect in terms of quality of jobs or the type of jobs. There's a lot of misinformation around choosing a job, actually. Yeah. I'm not sure if I can say too much about values and find job. Maybe someone else within the webinar or the audience has experience on that.
Sarah, anyone in the room want to comment on that? Or shall we
I
move
think we
to
can take
another
a few
question?
more from online. Christy, there's a lot in the chat.
Yep, okay. So there's a question here about how you fostered collaboration between or integrated I and the related but separate job creation intervention. And I'm curious about this myself because we have been working on a more of a job creation competitiveness project, and we're the workforce development provider, service provider, and there is this kind of tension there. And so I'm curious how you were able to work with those two.
The collaboration between whom? I didn't quite get that.
The I project and the related but separate job creation intervention.
Okay,
you
yeah.
had spoken about kind of this the employment training versus the job creation.
Sorry. Yes, exactly. That there's another project in Kosovo that works particularly on promoting employment creation. That's implemented by Swiss Contact. In general, that's an organization that we work very closely with. It's another Swiss organization, so we know each other quite well. There are a lot of joint meetings and activities happening. We do trainings and workshops together to also build a bit of a sense, a sort of common understanding of the approach that we choose, that we use. So also at the management level, there's a frequent exchange between our manager Tim and the manager of PPSE. In order to ensure that there's coordination between that. The donor STC is also playing an important role here. The donor calls, I believe, for monthly meetings in order to make sure that certain issues, questions are also discussed. There are synergies also in terms of the choice of sectors that projects work. So PPSE, the other project, has a very strong sectoral focus on sustainable tourism, for example, or agro-processing, and they focus much more on sort of the economic development aspect. Whereas when I looks at these sectors, we look a little bit more at the skills side within these sectors. So working with companies on establishing a link, for example, to vet schools. That would be an area that we would look at more closely, whereas PPSE would, for example, look a bit more strongly at questions like export promotion or product development and these type of questions. So there's a lot of coordination going on between these two projects, and that's also what we see happening in the other countries that I'm working with, that if the donor has that kind of portfolio perspective to youth employment, they do make an effort to also make sure that it's coordinated.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Do we have one question in the room?
There's actually two questions. Oh, great. Okay.
So my name is Alejandra. I manage the State Department funded Youth Ambassadors Program for Georgetown University. And my question is more kind of how you tailor the approach to each country, and like in the case of Kosovo specifically, to address cultural differences or within the youth that you're working with. Because as much as you'd like to apply the same approach everywhere, I think most of us know that you can't just cookie cut it to put it the same, and kind of what that looks like when you guys work with youth and figuring out where the gaps are, what they're lacking in training or opportunities for employment, anything like that.
No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, we don't want to sort of apply ready-made solutions to countries. We need very context-specific solutions in order to be more effective, in order to have a large-scale sustainable impact as well. Basically, with the market systems development approach, we have a framework basically that we can fairly flexible apply to different country contexts. The principles of project implementation are pretty similar actually. The question is more about how we fill that with content, and that's where we do a lot of analysis within the country. So that's one of our major activities that our projects do. They analyze all the time. Basically, they have monitoring systems that help them to learn and adapt their strategies on a continuous basis in order to make sure their strategies are relevant. It also means engaging with partners. The nice thing with a systems approach or market systems approach is that you don't come with ready-made solutions. You actually work on the solutions while you implement the projects. You work on solutions together with stakeholders and partners, and that's often quite a new approach to many people in our partner countries. They are used to a lot of projects coming in and sort of having a ready-made plan and agenda basically already, and not so much used to projects that approach problems quite open-minded, open-ended actually.
How do they respond to that?
It is a change of mindset, yes. So it's not always easy. I mean, we've been introducing this MSD approach in countries for the first time, actually, like in Albania, for example. It's never been used there before. So even with our own staff, it took some time for them to get used to the idea that nobody's going to tell them exactly what to do, but that developing a strategy together with partners is something that they need to engage with. So that requires really good people on the team. So I'm really sort of happy to have that actually. But it also requires a change of mindset on the side of the partners that we work with.
Yeah. We have another question in the room.
Thanks. My name is Sarah, and I work with the International Youth Foundation. My question is related to overlaying time and budget constraints onto some of this approach. And, you know, at my organization, we have some really wonderful systems work projects, but they're the larger budget, longer time frame. And a lot of the projects that I'm supporting are the corporate funded, short grant term, small budget. And so in terms of designing better projects, I have tons of ideas about what that could look like, how it could be more sustainable. But from your experience with those shorter projects in smaller budgets, where do you see, or where have you experienced some of that systems change wiggle room is?
Mm-hmm. It's true that system change often takes more time. So maybe it picks up more slowly, but the impact curve then basically or hopefully will continue to grow. Yeah. The number of people that benefit from certain solutions, ideas will increase over time. What we see with very short-term and results-driven type of projects is that the impact curve basically goes up very quickly. You have an immediate outreach to beneficiaries because you're basically providing training to young people. So, but once the project phases out, we see the impact curve going down again. So what we want to see is a continuous growth of that impact curve. Now, I think on the one side that requires a bit of a rethinking on the donor side, also on how to develop programs. I think there are many donors around that have already sort of integrated systems thinking into their program portfolio design. We're very lucky to work for one of them. SDC, for example, has a long-term project horizon. Is a project that has an 8-year horizon. There are some projects that are tendered out with a 12-year horizon already, so that's 3 successive 4-year phases. So there are some donors that already have that long-term perspective. The other thing I would say, we also need to get rid of the notion that system change is always very complex and matter that takes a long time. I think system change can also be a small innovation, a new practice introduced that quickly convinces others to copy and do the same. That can also be a system change, like a new business model. We've seen it with the online job portals. It barely took 3 years for these portals to catch on. So there are also, with the systems approach, there are also these kind of short-term gains that you can achieve. But yeah, I guess a degree of luck is also part of that.
Thanks for your questions. I know we had a couple of questions on measurement that Christy wanted to raise.
Sure.
From online. Christy?
Well, because they're so related, thank you, Sarah. They're so related to what you were just discussing, Matt, about system change and impact. There's 2 questions related to measuring systemic change. How do you evaluate it? How are you measuring and capturing change, either in terms of employer investment and skills development, changes at the policy level, or changes by service providers? And you just talked about, how you can take components and look at positive benefits. But is there some way in which you are measuring the systematic change, that larger level change?
In all our projects, in all our youth employment projects in the Balkans, we use the DCED standard for results measurement. If you can read more about that on the DCED website. It's basically a measurement system that builds on results chains or impact logics, where we build up a hypothesis that basically leads from our actions to the final impact, which is youth employment in this case. So and we're measuring different indicators basically along this impact hypothesis or theory of change, however you might want to call it. So technically that's the system that we use. And yes, sort of measuring system change, that's a huge debate actually on how to do that correctly. It's probably another webinar. But yes, I mean, there's a very interesting framework that we use, which you can read about in the operational guide that I showed earlier. It's called the Adopt, Adapt, Expand, Respond framework. So this framework basically helps us to measure the outcome of an intervention in terms of how what is the impact on an innovation or a new model with regard to immediate partners within a pilot stage, and how do we move from that pilot stage to a wider crowding in effect, both in the quantitative sense, that means, I don't know, more training providers crowding in, so how do we measure more training providers crowding in, but also in a qualitative aspect, in terms of deepening that systemic change. So how do other non-competing actors basically react to that innovation? Tim Sparkman, the project manager of I, for example, is now planning to do also something called outcome harvesting. So with this tool, we also want to see a little bit what is the wider impact on an intervention to I don't know, towards the society, the communities around that. So what impact does a better collaboration between private sector and the vet school in a certain municipality have on the wider community around that? So that's something interesting and new that we're about to try right now within the I project. So I'm very excited about to see the results of that as well. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and I think Christy had one from online. And then for those in the room, we have some time after to network and raise your questions as well. Christy?
Yes, there's actually two questions related to job matching. There's a question about the business model of the job matching firms, as well as a question regarding the job matching portals. If you could talk about what's worked well and not so well with the portals and maybe the business model of job matching. And then kind of related to that is the technology questions around, how's the technology being used for job matching? And then someone also asks about whether youth are connected through LinkedIn. So maybe you could talk just a bit about job matching.
Mm-hmm. Generally, if anyone has further deeper going questions on to that, you're most welcome also to contact our project people in the I project. So they're always happy to share some of their experiences. They probably know more about this than I do. But basically, changing the business model has not been very easy for the team initially. These 2 or 3 firms, they were very reluctant initially also to charge companies that were advertising on their platform. They were reluctant to charge them a fee for the advertisement because they thought, okay, if we're going to charge a fee, they will not come back. We will lose these companies actually. So the project helped to sort of gradually introduce the idea of a paid service to these online portals, and it works surprisingly well. If you see also the figures that I showed earlier, the number of enterprises using these platforms has increased actually from 600 initially to over 1,600 over a period of 3 years. So the introduction of a paid service model has not impacted the companies using this service. So that's been quite a positive experience actually, but it required a lot of work also with these companies, sort of a lot of coaching as well, and also giving them examples from other countries where it actually did work. So the model is basically companies paying for the vacancies that they advertise on these platforms, while young people can use these platforms for free. They can load up their profiles to these platforms, their CVs. So the income comes mainly from the company side. On the technology side, that's probably a question I would find hard to answer, but it's an online portal also in Kosovo, in the Balkan region. Most young people have a mobile phone, so I guess that the fact that young people use mobile internet technology probably contributed also to a very quick rise in the number of young job seekers using these platforms.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We are unfortunately out of time, but I wanted to thank our partner Helvetas and Herr and our moderator Christy Olenik. And thank you to everyone for joining today in person and online. You raised some really great questions for discussion. In a few moments, we're going to direct you to a survey for those of you online, and it takes just 2 minutes We really appreciate your feedback. This helps us create future webinars and strengthen our existing approach to creating virtual learning events. This webinar has been recorded, and this and the related materials will be on youtheconomicopportunities.org. You'll receive a link via email. And if you found this useful, please help us spread the word about these opportunities, these virtual learning events. I also want to point your attention to our YO Network's competitive call for proposals, which is now open. Applications are due April 6th. This is for our 2018 Global Youth Economic Opportunities Summit, which will take place September 25th to the 27th here in Washington, D.C. And you can learn more at youtheosummit.org. Thank you again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.